This is probably one scenario many gamers go through. A sequel to your favorite franchise is announced, but it will probably be months before it actually comes out. To pass the time, you analyze every piece of trailer footage and art that comes out, speculating in depth what could appear or happen in the game. This scenario has happened to me many times, but there was one particular instance that was especially interesting, because the game I was super excited to play for months already came out 8 years ago. Before we get into the meat of the story, I would like to give a little context. I was an avid fan of both Ace Attorney and Danganronpa, so I wanted to play games similar to them. This introduced me to the murder mystery conglomerate, which included games like Professor Layton, Ghost Trick, Hotel Dusk. I haven't played that one, but I really should. And the one I'm talking about today, Zero Escape. Back in March, I played the first game in the series, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, and I loved it. I've already made a video about it, so I won't go too deep into it, but that does bring me to my next point. After playing the game, I became obsessed with it. I made multiple videos, fan art, lo-fi edits, and even an otaku cover. So with that sort of enthusiasm, you would expect me to jump right onto the second game, Virtue's Last Reward. I mean, that's what I did with both Ace Attorney and Danganronpa, so what's different now? Well, it's actually because of my enthusiasm that I waited so long to play VLR. So, this is something I haven't told anyone yet, but I actually haven't played any of the Danganronpa games. I actually used no commentary YouTube walkthroughs instead. I usually use ROMs whenever I play games, but there are some platforms that do not support ROMs on my computer, such as with Danganronpa or VLR. However, I loved 999 so much that I refused to watch a mere playthrough of the sequel, and decided to play the game with my own hands. Unfortunately, I would need to wait a pretty long time to get my hands on this game, especially with the whole quarantine situation happening back then. So what did I do in the meantime? I speculated, of course. I tried to avoid anything Zero Escape related so I can go into the game as blind as possible, which meant I barely knew anything about the characters and setting. This caused me to speculate who the characters are, what they look like, and what they did, which led to some interesting conclusions. Let's start with the two main characters, Sigma and Phi, since, although I didn't know their names at the time, they were the only characters that I was able to look at for more than a millisecond without covering my eyes in fear. When first taking a glance at Phi, I actually thought she was the main protagonist. There's this white-haired, I think it's like white and black-haired girl who I think is the protagonist. It was mostly just wishful thinking, but I also thought she was more prominent on the 3DS cover, making her more important. Here's a drawing of what I thought she looked like, who I called Jessica. She kinda looks like a female version of Santa. So, because of that, I am going to call her Jessica, because apparently that is the first name of Mrs. Claus. I also suspected that Jessica over here would have the 9 bracelet, simply because that would be cool. I had some pretty interesting theories about her, such as, I don't know what on earth happened to Santa and June in that ending of 999. Did they just disappear into another realm? I don't know, I just thought it was funny. The remains of June and Santa that transformed into Jessica? I don't know. I also had speculations for Sigma, or Dex as I called him, but they were quite different from what Sigma was actually like. For one, I actually thought he had brown hair for a while. There's this brown-haired character that's next to her. I also thought he was in his early 30s, so I imagined him to serve as a father figure to Phi, which didn't really age well. I also thought he was a detective for some reason. I feel like he kinda looks like a detective, so I'm just gonna assume he's a detective. Just because I only allowed myself to see the two characters on the cover doesn't mean I didn't get to see any other characters on accident. Because of that, I had a couple more impressions and misconceptions of some of the other characters in the game. First of all, I knew that Clover was returning, and I described my glimpse of her new appearance as, she looks absolutely horrible, which is really stupid since she looks perfectly fine. Sure, her face is nothing like OG Clover's, but it definitely isn't something worthy of saying, now she's a walking fashion disaster, about it. The next character I saw was, he's like really big, he kinda looks like Seven if someone ripped his skin off and now he's a skeleton. Which later turned out to be Kay, and is somewhat correct as he is wearing a robot exoskeleton. The next two characters were a dude in a blue tracksuit, which was probably just Sigma again, and a white-haired old lady, which was probably just Phi again. There was also Dio, who I thought was a cowboy when I first saw a glimpse of him. The rest of the characters I drew were not based on characters I took a millisecond glimpse of, but instead were based off of certain plot points in 999 I cannot talk about due to spoilers. There is one more character I saw a small glimpse of, and that is the animal mascot of Zero Escape, which I described as a Monokuma Fortnite Tails doll alpaca. Turns out that alpaca was a rabbit. And yes, that is Clover over there controlling him. Although I mostly just speculated who the characters were, there were a couple plot points that I also theorized. The main ones have to do with Jessica and her relation to the rest of the cast, since she's the main character and all. I pictured that everyone besides Dax would see her as completely useless and look down on her. You see, I saw on Wikipedia that Virtue's Last Reward dabbled in a little game theory, no, not that one, and one aspect of game theory is called the Shapley value. Basically, it determines the value of certain teammates based on how much they contribute, and since the 9 bracelet never changes the digital root value, Phi is considered useless. The 9 bracelet does have one use though, and that's its ability to allow 2 people with a matching digital root to go through the same numbered door, but Phi wouldn't know that at the time. Even worse, I imagined Phi to be really bad at puzzles, hence the easy difficulty, so she wouldn't be useful in that category either. Then, later in the game, with the help of Sigma, Phi learns to be more confident in herself and discover that she's useful in her own way. Other pieces of game theory I expected to be in the game were zero-sum games, haha I get it cause zero, it has zero in the name, and the prisoner's dilemma, which, by the way, I am so proud of myself that I got that right. The plot point I had with Dax is that it turns out he was hired by the US government to investigate the disappearance of one of the characters in 999, and each of the other members in the Nonary game are potential suspects, including Phi. As for Clover, I imagined her to be similar to the rival archetype in Danganronpa, acting very suspicious and edgy throughout the game, though it is revealed that she has good intentions later on. I imagine Sigma would warn Phi not to trust her, while Clover would warn Phi not to trust him. Then there would be a scene where Phi has to make a choice to side with one and betray the other. The twist is that everyone's the mastermind in their own way or something. I don't know how that will work, but I thought it'd be very cool, so I just predicted that. So, after all that time drawing, theorizing, and memeing what would happen in VLR, I finally got the game. I still vividly remember how ecstatic I was as the game downloaded through Nintendo eShop. It took around 30 minutes to download, but I savored every moment of it. Once the downloading was done, I popped open my 3DS and had the biggest smile on my face as the opening started playing. Only for it to fade a few seconds later because, oh boy, these are some of the worst models I've ever seen on the 3DS. Maybe it's just because the sprite art in the previous game was so good, but I was really disappointed when I first saw these models. They're really dull in color, stiff in both expressions and pose, and often steer into the uncanny valley. You could make the argument that the game came out in 2012 and is just a product of its time, but Dual Destinies came out a year later and they still hold up today for the most part. I feel like I wouldn't have been too harsh on the models if it weren't for the fact that almost all the visual CGs use models instead of 2D images like in other games similar to it. These CGs really emphasize the flaws of these models, and using them ruins any emotion they were trying to go for. I shouldn't be too hard on VLR. It is done by a smaller studio, so I'll say something positive about the models. One thing I genuinely like about the models is that the mouths actually sync up to whatever they're saying. I think they're using some sort of technology that automatically makes the lip flaps based off of the audio read rather than syncing it up manually, and I found that to be pretty cool, and I was able to get used to the models after some time. One other thing that I found quite distracting in a negative way was the voice acting. Now, I'm not talking about the voice acting itself. I picked the Japanese audio and everyone sounds as they should. No, the problem I have with the voices is the audio quality. I don't know if this applies to the English voices, but the Japanese voices sound like the voice actor recorded on a cheap microphone, and I really shouldn't be talking right now. You're probably wondering why I'm being so negative about Virtue's Last Reward, and you probably think I hate Virtue's Last Reward or something, but I was actually starting out with the negatives to get out of the way, because Virtue's Last Reward is actually better than 999 in many aspects. One thing that I love about VLR is the Nonary game itself. When I heard that the Nonary game would return, I was very disappointed because I thought it would be repetitive. Well, fear not, as this Nonary game is a Nonary game in name only. This new Ambidex version of the Nonary game has a whole new set of rules and a completely different objective. Instead of just using the digital routes as static bracelet numbers to go through doors and find the 9th one, the 9th door is already in front of them. What they need to do now is get enough bracelet points, the number displayed on their bracelet, to be able to go through said door. To earn bracelet points, players must participate in A-B games, which are basically just the prisoner dilemma scenario I predicted before. Two parties are given the choice to either betray or ally one another. People who both ally get 2 points, people who both betray get 0, and if one person betrays while the other allies, the betrayer gets 3 points while the allier loses 2. If you don't know where the escape rooms come into play, they're where the tickets to the AB game are located. Honestly, the rules to this game are so much more complex and fun compared to the original that I genuinely want to play the Ambidex game with my friends, if there wasn't any death involved.
Mr. Beast, make it happen!
What I also really like about Virtue/Reward is that it took all the flaws I had with 999 and fixed them. Game was too easy? Well, the game is now more difficult, giving me a run for its money while also having an easy mode for people who are used to 999. Replaying the game was boring and repetitive? Well, the new jump feature allows players to go through any point of the game they've already played, and throughout my complete playthrough of VLR, I never had to redo any of the puzzles, not even once. That's right, each ending gives you a unique puzzle experience every single time, and that's a lot considering there are 24 endings. Endings could be experienced out of order? Not anymore. There are now story locks so that you'll only be able to experience the ending when you have the proper context to it. With the fact that I fixed every single one of my flaws with 999, surely this game is far superior than the original, right? Well, before we jump to conclusions, there are a couple other things that I have to talk about before I share my overall opinion on the game. One thing I'd like to talk about are the characters, which, to be brutally honest, are pretty good. Ah, you thought I'd say they're bad, didn't you? But guess what? I tricked you. I'll go more into detail in the spoiler section, but for now I'd say they're basically on par with the original cast, with some being better while others being worse. My personal favorites are Luna and Kay. They're absolutely wonderful. I also want to talk about Sigma as, despite thinking he was a kind-hearted father figure, is one of the worst protagonists I have ever played as. No, not as in he's poorly written, but just that he's so unapologetic and unsubtle with everything he does. He is literally the ultimate trash garbage scum of the earth, and I love it. I actually like him a bit more than Junpei. Sure, Junpei's wholesome, but he's also a tad bit boring. While Sigma may be cursed, he's also pretty fun. I also want to talk about the deuteragonist I thought was a protagonist, Phi. No, Sigma and Phi are not codenames, and no, they aren't the most unfortunate names in the game. There's literally a kid named Quark. Quark, that is his given name! Back to Phi, she really reminded me of Kyoko from Trigger Happy Havoc, both being very stoic and mysterious, knowing more than they should about things. However, despite seeing Kyoko first, I actually vastly prefer Phi over her. Despite resembling Kyoko, Phi is actually pretty sarcastic, dry, and blunt, as if she's a combination of Kyoko and Byakuya. Quite different from the shy emo girl I thought she'd be. Not to spoil for my ranking video, but I always found Kyoko to be quite boring. She has all the essentials to be a good character, but she just needs that one little thing to make her complete. I feel like Phi has just the right amount of spice to make herself interesting. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't talked about a certain elephant in the room, or should I say, Clover in the room? I heard beforehand that she got a massive downgrade, which really scared me as she was one of my favorite characters in 999. The good news is that she's not nearly as bad as I thought she'd be, especially with how people talked about how awful she is. She was okay and I liked her enough, but then again maybe it's because I took a 4-month gap playing between games. However, there are many instances where this Clover doesn't act like the Clover before, and that she's portrayed to be quite airheaded, which is strange since 999 Clover was never really airheaded to begin with. Now, there's a term that has been thrown around in the cartoon community called flanderization. It's a process in which, over time, writers tend to exaggerate a certain trait of a character so much that said character becomes a mockery of what they once were. For example, the character this trope is named after, Ned Flanders from The Simpsons, was a nice, caring, ordinary dude who just so happened to be a Christian. However, as time went on, writers kept exaggerating the Christian aspect of this character so much that he is now the stereotypical Bible-thumping, close-minded Christian. What's weird about this case is that Clover wasn't Flanderized. If she was, the writers would have taken a trait she already possessed, like her moodiness or occasional anger, and turned it up to 11. Instead, the writers introduced a trait that was never present in the character to begin with, not even slightly. In fact, Clover is shown to be the opposite of airheaded, and that's what's particularly strange about this scenario. Speaking of strange, there is something really strange about Clover's model. Take a look at Clover's concept art showing all of her expressions. Pretty normal, right? Now take a look at the 3D models in comparison. Notice something different? Even in the emotions that are supposed to frown in the artwork, the 3D models give her a grin on her face. This particular pose is the only one in the entire game that depicts Clover frowning, and it doesn't even show up until midway through the game. This means that, throughout the majority of Virtue's Last Reward, Clover is always seen with a smile on her face, no matter how dire the situation is, which unintentionally gave me a much different impression of her. It doesn't take a psychologist to say that different facial expressions convey certain emotions, and that when the expression contradicts the emotion portrayed, something feels off. Just take a look at Clover's reaction when she finds out she's playing the nonary game again. Now doesn't that look like she's about to laugh maniacally and shoot up Jimmy Fallon or something? In short, I don't mind and actually liked Clover in VLR. However, I perfectly understand why people are disappointed, and she definitely isn't 999 Clover. Oh yeah, I almost forgot about Zero the Third, or Zero Jr. as he's called. Although I got his species wrong, I was spot on about him being a Monokuma clone. He's so Monokuma that whenever he talks, I can just imagine the Monokuma theme playing in the background. No, I don't even need to imagine it. I hallucinate it because of how similar this dude is to Monokuma. In fact, he's so Monokuma that his Japanese voice actor, Tarako, is the same as Monokuma's. But you know what? I like Zero Jr. He's very fun, and I always wanted to see Monokuma in a Zero Escape game, so in a way, I got exactly what I wanted. One more thing about the characters I have to mention is that, unlike 999, some characters get more development and screen time than others, even with the fact that every ending is character specific. It isn't that drastic, but it is an effect, and it's more prominent than in 999. Despite fixing all the problems I had with 999, there was one big problem I had with VLR, and that has to do with the ending. Don't worry, I won't be spoiling it here, I'm just telling you how I felt about it. For 999's ending, I felt very satisfied, feeling like it was a nice conclusion to the game. For VLR, I was a mix of confused and bored for the last couple hours of the game, not knowing what anything was going on, but not really caring either. In fact, when I finished the game, I didn't even know I finished it. I literally searched up game forums to see when VLR actually ended. Even for a cliffhanger, it should be made clear that this game has officially come to an end. Even some narration like, "And so, will our heroes be able to resolve this conflict? Stay tuned for the next game," would suffice. Oh yeah, this game has a cliffhanger ending, which I could make an entire video as to why that's bad. Overall, I think that VLR is a great game that is about on par with 999. It has a lot of quality of life upgrades while also giving us a bigger and better nonary game with new characters you will enjoy. Playing it genuinely made me feel like I was playing 999 all over again, which is always a good thing. However, like all games, there are still plenty of flaws with it, such as with the ending. Although I got a lot of things wrong, I'm happy that I theorized in the first place as it allows me to compare and contrast my stories. You know how I said in my 999 review that you should only play the DS version? Well, for VLR, I strongly advise you to play anything besides the 3DS version. This is because, in the 3DS version, there is a game-breaking glitch in the game that could force you to delete your game and start all over again, and considering that this is a 30-hour-long game, this is really bad. If you already have the game on your 3DS, there are a few warnings you must follow. Number 1. Do not save in any escape portion of the game. If you have to save, jump to the novel section right before it. Number 2. Even in the novel sections, never save in the crew quarters, the rec room, or the PEC. If you want to be super duper uber safe and never experience any risk, I highly advise saving only in the warehouse novel sections where you aren't in any puzzle rooms, whether it be normal or escape mode. Fortunately, this only affects the 3DS version of the game, so the Vita, PS4, and Steam versions are all safe to play. If you played 999 and want to play VLR, it is easily accessible on Steam for $30 and comes with an admittedly inferior version of 999, which is kind of a steal. And as of making the script, it's $60 off! Let's just hope I make this video in time, and it's not. Sorry for letting you guys down. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you soon. That is, if you haven't played Virtue's Last Reward yet. I find it actually funny that two of my predicted characters kind of fused into one in an unexpected way. One of my predictions is that I thought a character that appeared in 999 that wasn't a nonary player would appear in this game as one. I expected it to be one of those characters from the first Nonary game, but I had no idea it would be all ice. Speaking of which, when I got a brief glimpse of Luna, not only did I think she had the one bracelet, but I also thought she was one of those Nonary kids. The second character that I'm talking about is Sigma, or Dex, who I thought would work for the US government in order to investigate the disappearances of the Ninth Man and Cap. But it turns out that I was kind of right, just with the wrong character. Alice works for the government and is investigating the whereabouts of Cradle Pharmaceutical, where Nine and Cap work, and the rest of Free the Soul. So I basically got one character plot point right, just with the wrong character. Something also unusual is what happened with Dio and Luna. Usually I would rule out the typical rival character because it would feel too obvious, automatically making them a red herring, and would pick less obvious characters for the twist villain. So having the red herring actually be the villain is quite refreshing, especially since he was a certain type of rude character that doesn't usually turn out to be the twist villain, such as Mondo or Fuyuhiko. At the same time, there's a reason why this twist isn't done as much. The point of having a twist villain exist is because it isn't what you expect, but Dio is already kind of a bad person, so it's not nearly as surprising to find out he's done terrible things as opposed to another character. Another problem I had with Dio is that it felt like nearly everything bad that happened was his fault because of course it was. He's Dio. He tied up Clover and Tenmyoji, killed Kei and Akane, and practically did every murder that wasn't Radical 6 related or his own. On the other hand, I am so happy that Luna's not evil, because not only is that quite cliche, I also love Luna from the beginning, and, like Dio, it's nice to have a character who's just as sweet and loving as she appears to be. No twists involved. What was a twist was who Zero turned out to be, which was none other than Sigma himself. I always wanted to experience a protagonist as the mastermind twist, and I feel like it makes sense with all the wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff going on. Speaking of which, have you ever heard of power creep? It's a term used in various games where characters and cards get more powerful over time to the point where once normal characters and cards are now considered extremely weak. Well, I feel like that's kinda similar to what's happening in the Zero of Escape series. For 999, there were just some kids with telepathy and one of them needed to time paradox their way out of death. Sure, it's a bit convoluted, but it only takes a couple seconds to figure out what's going on. What I do like about the psychic powers for both games is that they aren't just there because it's cool, they're there to explain certain gameplay elements, such as experiencing multiple endings. And for VLR, the timey-wimey stuff was also pretty easy to understand until the very end, where walls of text explaining how they should go back in time, but also they can't go back in time or you must do it in a specific order, and Sigma is Kyle and question mark what? Honestly, my brain turned off in that segment, which is usually a bad sign when it comes to endings in my opinion. So yeah, those were my opinions on Virtue's Last Reward that I couldn't say due to spoilers. But wait! There's more! Okay, so while I was writing the script, I was playing the third game, Zero Time Dilemma, and something happened that I want to talk about. You know how I made a prediction that Sigma was Fi's adoptive father figure, and how I said that aged poorly in VLR? Well, somehow it aged even worse. Sigma isn't Fi's father figure. He is her father.